Hi, I'm Lauren.
And I'm Callie.
And welcome back to the Book Common Room podcast. Hello, welcome back to another episode of the Book Common Room podcast. We're so glad for you guys to join us. The holiday seasons have arrived.
Merry
Season's
Christmas.
Greetings. Merry Christmas.
We have a cute little
Happy
festive.
Hanukkah.
Can you see? It's beautiful. Lauren put it up.
Yep, I did. We are
What did
reading.
we celebrate?
Yeah, we're reading quite a pretty Christian text for today. Charles Dickens, A Christmas Carol.
It also fit though. We kind of wanted to do a classic.
Yeah.
Dickens is amazing. Christmas Carol's also short. We're in the
Super short.
trenches of finals right now.
Yes.
So sorry if the episodes are a little short, but
Yes. That's just what we can do right now, though, folks. And we're just glad that we can be here. So,
plus I love this book, so.
yes, I
great.
had never read it before. So, anyways, we just wanted to give you guys a seasonal greeting, and then we can hop into the introduction of this book.
Yeah.
All right. So, Callie already started talking about this, but we felt like this was a good book. Well, it was nice and short. Also, it just gets you in the holiday spirit, or helps you kind of reprioritize what you should be focusing around on the holidays. But also, Charles Dickens is a classic, and A Christmas Carol is very accessible for readers. So if you're wanting to get into classical literature, this is a really good way to go. Charles Dickens is pretty intense in most of his writings, and A Christmas Carol is probably
Very
the
sad.
best way. It's probably the best way to ease your way into his writings, because he was a very influential writer and influenced a lot of books that we read today. So we'll go into that a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, I was honestly really surprised the first time I read this how easy it was to read.
Yeah.
And how accessible it was. Because how does A Tale of Two Cities starts?
It was the best of times. It was the worst of times.
And then is he the one where the next page is just one sentence?
Yeah.
Is that him?
I think so. I wouldn't put it past him.
So growing up, Charles Dickens just seemed like this massive author that I don't know if I'll ever really be able to read.
Yeah.
But Christmas Carol was an awesome start. Because I got used to how he writes, but then the version we have, if you get the Penguins Classic,
Yes.
it starts on page 14. So it's under 100 pages.
Yeah.
It's
And
super short.
The thing with this too is if you get this version, which we just like because it gives a lot of context to the book. There's terms that people say in the 19th century that I just don't understand.
Yeah.
It'd be as fast as Jack Robinson or things like that.
Yeah.
I'm like, what is this talking about? And so it helps kind of clarify if there's those moments, which there aren't very many. And then there's a bunch of other Christmas stories he's written. But A Christmas Carol is kind of the middle of all these stories in the book.
Yeah.
But yeah, we'll hop into kind of a little bit about Charles Dickens and introducing this book. He was born in 1812 and died in 1870, and he was one of the most famous and celebrated novelists of the Victorian era and created some of the most memorable characters in world literature. He completed 15 full-length novels, including Oliver Twist, Great Expectations, Bleak House, which I do want to try Bleak House. I feel like that has been talked about a lot amongst my peers, and I'm like, I wonder if I have to read that. Little Dorrit and the semi-autobiographical David Copperfield. He has 5 novellas, including A Christmas Carol, and those other Christmas stories is kind of what those other novellas are. And then hundreds of short stories and essays, and much of his work is centered around social criticism. He spent a lot of his writing explaining how he feels society needs to change. And so that's a lot of what he would be exploring.
And this one's all about child labor, right?
Yes.
And just how we treat children. Isn't that what this one's mostly about?
Yes, because it's the plight of the poor and the children and the situation on and we'll go into this more, but it was kind of insane how kids were working at this time. And there's a big part in this book that it explores that we'll put in our spoiler episode, kind of breaking down what he's saying, because you don't really get that in the film adaptations as much. Usually it's about Scrooge's character, less about society itself.
Yeah.
So I'm pretty excited about that, but
Bah humbug.
bah humbug. Yeah, so it was published, this book was published on the 19th of December back in 1843. And the illustrations are by John Leech, and I love them. They're so cool.
They are cool. I've never seen them before. This is the first copy I've read that's had the illustrations in them.
Yes, and it's cool because I feel like they influenced, I feel like without those illustrations, it would have been harder to bring A Christmas Carol to life. Because they do a good job in the adaptations of the book look very accurate to the depictions and the pictures.
Yeah.
And we'll display some of those pictures for you to see if you don't have the book that we have. But the first edition of this book sold out by Christmas Eve, as soon as he had it published. So it's really interesting because further editions would immediately follow, and it would continue to sell well up until the spring.
Do you know when in his timeline he published this one? What he had published before this? Was he already an established author?
Yes, he was an established author, and he was pretty popular from the get-go.
Oh, okay.
So his first thing that he had done was the Pickwick Papers, and that was in 1836. So a little under 10 years before A Christmas Carol would come out. And it was pretty influential because he started serialized publications. He's the one that started that. So, in every newspaper, a new chapter would come out. So, that was... It's not that he was the one that started it, but he's the one that made it popular.
Yeah.
And so, that was a huge thing that he did that impacted, readers and made it very successful for him. Mm-hmm. So, from the get-go, he was pretty popular as a writer.
He was very accessible to then.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then he wrote Nicholas Nickleby, The Old Curiosity Shop, Barnaby Rudge, Martin Chuzzlewit, and then A Christmas Carol, the novella of the collections of his different Christmas stories came out. So, yeah, he was pretty established, but this was a book that was constantly being reprinted. So, as soon as it came out, it was selling out up until the spring of the next year. And it's never been out of print since.
That's crazy.
Mm-hmm. And it has been adapted countless times into films, television, and theater, and several musicals, all circulated around A Christmas Carol. And someone put it was it's the things that have never been out of print are the Bible and Dickens' A Christmas Carol.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Dickens.
Yeah, go him. Something that surprised me was that he received little formal education.
Yeah, I didn't know that either.
So something that was pretty tragic to read, but was interesting was at age 12, he was sent to go work in the workhouses because the debt collectors imprisoned his father and his mother and his 7 siblings.
Isn't that what Scrooge is? Isn't he a debt collector? That's why he has so much money?
Probably.
I feel like that's what Scrooge is and why he's so bitter. And Marley. And then isn't there the clerk? Oh, what's his name? Bob?
Bob. His nephew,
isn't he in debt to Scrooge? And that's why he has to work for him?
Yeah, so he is a debt collector. And that's where his wealth comes from, is lending money at high interest rates.
I Googled it, and it doesn't say it in the book, but people speculate he's, at the time, was worth $1 billion.
That's crazy.
Isn't that crazy?
For the character of Scrooge. That's so interesting. So I love that he's using this kind of shadow of his childhood past of debt collectors and made it into a character that you root for.
Yeah.
Somehow.
Huh. Interesting.
Yeah. So that was interesting. He went to the workhouse and was buying out his family from prison because of being in debt. And so he worked in a shoe blacking factory, and that's what he did until he was able to get his family out of prison. And so this childhood poverty and feelings of abandonment are very prominent themes within his books. And although unknown to his readers until after his death, this would heavily influence Dickens' later views on social reform and forever haunt the world he would create through his fiction on child labor. And he was just always an advocate for children.
Yeah.
So that was really interesting to me.
I know. Well, we mentioned before, this is a very Christian tale, but I think that's mostly just because it's surrounded by Christmas. But there's not really that much mention, though, of Christ.
Yeah.
I think there is a little bit.
Yeah, there's 2 parts, and he writes it in a very beautiful way.
Yeah.
Because it's just reminding you what the center of Christmas is, because Christmas is a Christian holiday.
Yeah.
So that's why it is like a Christian book.
Mm-hmm.
But there was probably 2 parts where he mentioned Christ, and I thought they were pretty powerful.
Yeah.
But it wasn't like constantly talking about Jesus.
Yeah, it's still more about the social aspect of it.
Yeah.
So lots of people can relate to it, and not just like that one
Christian
group of people
denominations.
can, like everybody can not necessarily relate, but understand where he's coming from.
For sure. And it's really, that's the other thing I really like about him, is he's good at setting the scene, but also like his character work is pretty incredible. Something that I loved about this book was the incredible character work and like the social commentary. And I talked about this in, not me, our class talked about it in my creative writing class about Charles Dickens. We just were talking about his flat characters and what that means. And I didn't really know what it meant exactly. It's usually like there's a character in the story that just moves the plot forward, and that's why they exist. So it's not like they have like an
Brandon
arc.
Sanderson in the past uses his female characters to do this.
Yes. Unfortunately.
Sorry. I know the new book just came out, but...
But this is the thing. It's a new book that came out in an archive that has female characters that I don't like. I skip their chapters.
Yeah.
I only read it for 2 guys.
Yep.
Actually. So, digression.
Sorry, I didn't mean to make that negative.
No, but it just gives you example and context. Because if you like Brandon Sanderson, that's great. Like, I just personally do feel like I like Dickens better because he can round out even the flat characters.
Yeah.
And an example of this, you'll get in the later stories.
I'm sorry, Brandon Sanderson fans. I love Tress of the Emerald Sea.
Yes.
Okay. Anyways, keep going. Sorry.
No. You needed to say that. It's all good. But there is, this isn't a spoiler, but this is like, I'm just giving an example of like how Dickens rounds out his like flat characters, and like there are these like ghosts, and it's not even like a huge spoiler because I love how we're doing a non-spoiler episode.
I know,
even though
but I think everybody knows.
But the book is different. There's like things in the book that I'm like, oh wow, I'm glad I'm reading this. And I personally do think that this is going to become an annual read. Because it has interesting things that movies don't usually grapple with. Which a lot of it is like the social commentary and like the child labor stuff. Like you don't even really get that in the adaptations we see in theater and movies, but in the book you do. But there's like these ghostly men, and it's funny because like they're flat characters, but he gives them quirks.
Yeah.
Like one is singing, or one is like was doing this weird thing, and like it's like these flat characters that are important for the plot, but there's reality to them.
Yeah.
So I think that's pretty hard to do. Like he does it to every single one of his characters. Like there's not just someone that you're like, who the heck is that? Like he gives some sort of personality to them, which I think is pretty cool.
I think in the adaptations, anytime they focus on his nephew, and like when it goes off, and there's that scene where this is I feel bad. This is the non-spoiler. This isn't a spoiler. Yeah. But anyways, it's Christmas Day. Fred's talking to his friends. And I always didn't really like that spot in the movie. No. I was like, what's really the point? Like, we kind of get it. Yeah. Scrooge is bitter. No one really likes him. Yeah. But in the book, I liked it. It made sense that it was there. Yes. Yeah. And it added to the story.
And also, it was a little less negative than I thought. Because in the movies, they're like, oh, Scrooge sucks. But it's like in the book, like they do it differently, and we can go
really
into it.
Stood up for him. His nephew.
His nephew, like actually was like, we still need to drink to the health of these people,
and it didn't feel condescending. In the movie, it felt sarcastic. Yeah. But in this one, I don't know if it was just because I was reading it and the voice in my head wasn't sarcastic.
I didn't get that though either. Like I felt the same when I was reading it, and even like the people that took stuff from him. It was interesting how that dynamic was.
That part creeps me out the most out of everything.
It is the creepiest part in the movie, I think. Because it's just, I don't know, it's kind of weird that...
We'll go into it in the spoilers.
Yeah, but anyways, it was Charles Dickens popularized books to be a main form of entertainment. That's basically his impact on literature and like the literary world was like, because he serialized his publications, people were using books as a way to entertain themselves, which wasn't like a huge thing at the time.
Well, not a lot of people could read, and it was just hard to get. People were poor. It was hard to get books.
Yeah. And not many people were reading until books were being circulated into libraries and like the creation of libraries. He was an interesting guy. Like you'll find dark things about him too. Like we went into it about Mary Shelley, but he did like cheat on his wife with an actress, I think.
Come on, dude.
Yeah, I know that it happened, but I'm not sure with who exactly. And so that was pretty sad. And like him and his wife had 10 kids. Like,
wow.
Yeah, he had lots of kids. He wanted to. He's such a cool guy, but also like he is also human, and you're just like, come on, man.
What are you doing?
Yeah, but yeah, that was like a huge thing. Was people just weren't reading, and because he was like making it accessible to people and like serializing publications into like newspapers, and it was like the way, I don't know, it's like nowadays you're waiting for episodes to come out. Yeah. It's like you were getting that with books, and it just became a popular form of entertaining yourself. So I think that was pretty cool.
That is cool. Another person who's just getting more people to read.
I know.
We love it.
I know. Okay, so let's hop into the origins of the story itself. Like, where did this come from? Why was he writing about this? Because I was very curious about it. So at this time, and we kind of touched on this a little bit, but the 1840s were labeled as a time of like the hungry 40s. People were just starving. There was like a brutal combination of trade slump leading to economic depression and mass unemployment. And like there was harvest failures, and then there's inflated bread prices, so people couldn't even get bread. And it's like so interesting reading this because I'm like thinking about nowadays, and I'm like, oh, eggs are so expensive, and cheese is so expensive. And like, while that is true, we're not starving like these people were. At least not in masses like these people were in the 1840s. So for the working class and the poor especially, these were extremely tough times. The country was also undergoing mass industrialization. So this is also like Charles Dickens is like known for how he depicts London, and just city life, the working class, and how like industrialization was changing the landscape. And so that was another point that he brings into his writing a lot. So yeah, the country was struggling, people were struggling, especially the most vulnerable, and I think some of the most vulnerable people are children, especially within this age.
Yeah, well, and if you've got people who are having 10 kids, but they don't have the money to have 10 kids, yeah.
But the thing is, having so many kids made work.
Yeah,
that they made more money with more kids because their kids would work. So that was just like the way you survived, which was just also tragic. So against this, Dickens was nearing his 30s on a tidal wave of success. Like we mentioned, like he was very popular from the get-go, which he did go back to school eventually.
Good for him.
But he used his writing to be constantly paying off his dad's debt. And so times were still tough for him because he had so many kids, and also because like his writing was just constantly having to make money and like pay off things that needed to be paid off. So the money was just always going.
Yeah.
Despite his success. So, and also I think what was interesting was the Queen loved Charles Dickens. Like everyone loved Dickens.
That probably helped with his success.
For sure. Like a lot of people read, especially the Queen, and he was just very beloved. So beloved. This is something I had recently read. He was so beloved that he just wanted to be buried in kind of like an unmarked area, like around family, keep it quiet, keep it small.
Yeah.
No, they did like a massive thing for him. They put him in that like, I should remember this, but there's like a special place for poets to rest.
I know what you're talking about.
And he has like a place there, and that's what he didn't want. They like didn't do at all what he wanted when he died, because they just like he was so beloved by everybody.
He was a celebrity of the time.
Yes. So by 1843, Dickens was also in dire need of cash despite all of this. Like kind of rewinding a bit before his death. But he was like selling pretty poorly, and he needed something. Basically he was in this moment of crisis where he's like, I gotta pull out a banger of a book. Like it needs to be popular, it needs to get people to read, but also like he couldn't do it without bringing in some sort of social commentary. So like it was kind of like under pressure to produce like what ends up being A Christmas Carol. And by this point he has like a 5th kid. So they're just coming.
Well, there you go.
And he's just trying to support them while still paying off his parents' debt. And so he was in this crisis and trying to figure out what he could do to like make more money quickly, while also like trying to still be an advocate for the people. And so he was like working on a pamphlet called An Appeal to the People of England on Behalf of the Poor Man's Child. And it was like this pamphlet to go through, like he just wanted it to be like a powerful blow to like, as like for like social criticism, for people to be like, oh my gosh, like we need to change, like we need to improve these things in the economy. How can we do this? He just wanted to create a conversation about like the plight of the poor children. But then he was like, instead of a pamphlet, let's do a book. That's what he ends up doing. Like he writes something, he's like, and like this is something that a critic had called him. They said instead of the pamphlet, they called it was like 20 times the force like of what a pamphlet could have been was A Christmas Carol, basically, to these critics' minds, because he put it, instead of it being like at you kind of commentary, it was a story that people could relate to and be like, oh my gosh, like look at it. It was more accessible for people to witness like the need to change, I guess, and the need to change on an individual level to like the scale of a society, which I think is kind of crazy that he was able to do that. And again,
to bring it back to the point of Scrooge being the debt collector, it's interesting he didn't have it in the child's perspective. It was in Scrooge's perspective.
Yeah.
Who was the person that hated Christmas.
Yes. And that's the other thing too, is because like, I mean, like Oliver Twist came later, but that was from the perspective of a child. Like he often did use children as his like POV. Maybe like because he could speak to it because he was a child having to face poverty and like having to be working. But then he was like, he chose to be the voice of his enemy, or like of the poor man's enemy. Yeah. So it is so interesting that he chose that outlet.
Because it still feels a little bit like an attack, right?
Yeah.
Like if you're that person reading it, like, oh, I'm being depicted as this person that's hated.
Yeah.
And I mean, it changes, right?
Yeah.
But at the beginning, all you know is, oh, everyone hates me.
Yes. And it's interesting too because it's not narrated by Scrooge.
No.
There is a narrator and people just are like, it's Charles Dickens. Like they associate Charles Dickens as the narrator of this story.
I had assumed that too.
Yeah.
But I guess we don't know that, so we can't
But the
really
narrator's
say.
like harsh on Scrooge.
Yeah.
So like the narrator doesn't particularly like him.
Yeah.
But also he's funny.
He is funny.
He's so funny. Like he just says funny stuff throughout the book.
What's the very, very first line? It made me laugh.
I put like so many like I put ha-has in my book when I just am like it's not even like some like amazing comment.
Molly was dead to begin with. Like what a way to start a book.
Yeah, but it was like the narrator trying to be like convince you and be like this is why it's crazy that this happens is because he was dead. Or like they are, like, the heaviest rain and snow and hail and sleet could boast of the advantage over him in only one respect. They often came down handsomely, and Scrooge never did. It's just so funny. And so it's interesting that he's taking the perspective of a debt collector, like someone that's very hated amongst the poor. Or not even just hated, just feared.
Yeah.
Like, he is, like, this person that people were afraid of. It wasn't
has
like
all the power.
Yeah, and like in the book they do a good job of like showing that people were still respectful but still like afraid. There's like a level of fear around him. And so they chose that while also approaching social commentary very humorously when it's something very serious that he's talking about. So I think that was
and also kind of childlike. It's a deeper topic, but he leaves it pretty open-ended and suggestive, so you can go in and he's just opening the conversation.
Yeah.
Like, this is what's going on. I'm going to introduce this to you so then you now want to go and learn more about it and hopefully make change.
Yeah. So, yeah, he turned, like, what would have been more of a strong pamphlet into a book, into a story of 5 chapters. It's only 5 chapters long. And it's interesting because I don't know. Someone called him like this gentle spirit of humanity is kind of how they put him, and how like he has an ability to make the reader laugh and cry, to open his hands and open his heart to charity, even towards the uncharitable. So I thought that was cool.
I also feel like that's very refreshing to learn about an author like this, because I feel like a lot of times we talk about these great authors, it's like, oh, they were this horrible racist.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't know if he was or not. He could have been.
Yeah.
But there's always just like this like very, very negative, like, oh, I feel a little bad talking up this person's work because he wasn't the best person.
Yeah.
I mean, he did cheat on his wife.
Yeah.
We won't diminish that. But I do like that he was just kind of like Santa Claus.
Yes. And like
this jolly person who kind of knew the right way to live.
Yeah.
And just wanted everybody to just like, especially children, like be equal.
Yeah.
And be treated right.
He was like, children shouldn't be in workhouses. Like, period.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people also would like, and well, I'll tag like sources that I pulled from like in articles or like news articles I've read about people's perspective and impact of Dickens. But they would mention his writing as like a personal kindness. Like what he was doing was a kindness to people and getting them to kind of wake up. But also like, it's crazy. He was using these books. Like these days, I feel like, I think it's always been like this, but these days particularly, I feel like there's a lot of escapism to books. And of course, like some will grapple with like racism, or they'll grapple with sexism, or I don't know, family dynamics, friendships, like, which are important. But it was interesting that Charles Dickens was a form of entertainment, but such a clear commentary on like how society is and his criticism.
He's a realist.
Yeah.
I also do think that's interesting that he's writing this coming out of like the Romantic period or the Romanticism movement.
Yeah, because the Victorian era was very different.
Yeah, like nature, and we're gonna like lose ourselves in the beauty. And he's like, nah, there's some like bad things going on. We should talk about it.
Well, that's the thing. I think he felt like sometimes the Romantics were not grounded, which I think
it's interesting because they think they are.
They think they are because they're in like their nature. They're about like preservation.
Yeah.
But the Victorian era was like taking you into the thick of the city and London and like industrialization and poverty. And so I'm not saying that the Romantics didn't do that, but they didn't do it like Dickens or like that Victorian phase. There's a lot less of that personal eye.
When I think of the Romantic period, I don't know if you've ever read this, The Sorrows of Young Werther. It's this guy. It's another really short one. We might do it for the podcast. I don't know. It's a novella. Basically, this guy's like, I'm in love with this girl who's already married to another man. Oh. And so he like obsesses about this girl. And it's supposed to be a commentary on pining and love and like someone who understands love too much and it makes him go insane because he loves the woman, but he also kind of falls in love with the husband too and is like obsessed with this couple. It's weird.
That is interesting.
But it's still like the Romantics think they're so grounded because they understand that aspect, but that still feels up in the air to me.
Yeah. And I think they might be approaching this like similar things.
Yeah.
Because the Romantics, while none of them, the Romantics, none of them really were, there's probably a few that kind of understood poverty and like Wordsworth was a major romantic and though he was born into the gentry, he still had to like live by his pen at one point, like where it was like giving him constant headaches and he was getting sick because he was like, I have to support my family on this writing now.
The Brontes.
Like they want to write because they like it. Yeah. But then it comes to a point where they live by their pen. Yeah. And so then it's like less fun. Yeah. And so there was that, but Charles Dickens was someone who actually lived in poverty and knew what it was like and could actually speak to it. So I think that's another reason he was so popular for both the monarchy and also like poor people. So anyways.
And even today, we don't live in the 1840s, gladly. Yeah. I wouldn't want to. Yeah. But you can still look into it and see and relate to it. Yeah. It's still open. And I mean, if you're, I feel like a good person, you care about the welfare of children. Yeah. And you'll want the best for them. And that's something that we can all care for. Yeah. And then if you are younger, it's like, oh, I'm that kid that he's talking about. Yeah. So it's like, I grew up on the movies and the story. Yeah. And I was always like, oh, I love the Christmas spirit in there. And yeah I love like house, like the story that's going on. Yes. And I'm trying to say things without spoiling it.
Yeah.
So I don't know if it makes sense.
No, I get what you're saying, because it's like, A Christmas Carol is just like a fun movie to kind of like the adaptation.
Yeah.
It's just something fun to kind of get into the Christmas spirit and just see that people can change.
Yeah.
People are capable of change. And I have a comment on that, actually. Like, I think Scrooge, like in the movies, it felt like he didn't change until like a certain point, really, is when it changed. Like, he turned his life around.
I thought the same thing. I know what you're going to say.
But there were moments throughout where I was like, he already has like a pretty soft heart. Mm-hmm. So I
already know when you're talking about too.
so I'm just thinking like a lot of people kind of rev it up for like a single moment, but he's pretty compassionate early on. Yeah. It was just the fact that he needed to walk in someone else's shoes. Yeah. And sometimes those shoes were even himself in his prior life. Like, there are moments in our own life where it's like we are completely this is just life. We're always different versions of ourselves. We're constantly being like, I feel completely different from the person I was like 6 months ago. Like, that's just kind of how it goes. But being able to constantly like learn and like reflect is kind of what this book brings about. So it's a lot deeper than just, I don't know, like holly jolly vibes. It's also a time to really reflect and be doing that not just at this time of year. It
just comes back to humanity, what it means to be human. Yeah. I think if you look at all the great classics and why they've survived so long, usually they're about that. Like, that's the core of just humanness, what it means to be a good human, what it could be to be a bad human. Those are bad words to say.
They're like arbitrary terms, but it's just like what it means to be good and less good. Yeah. Yeah. But, yeah, I love that. And it's true. Like, and that's another thing for like people that are wanting to get into reading more. This book really is, I feel like, a doorway to people wanting to love to read, because it's simple, it's short, it's a beloved story. The novel it's only 5 chapters. It adds more context to the stories we love that are adapted, like A Muppet Christmas Carol. Love that adaptation. I think they do it so well. But it adds so much more to the experience, and also like it makes you feel like these people, even though they lived so long ago, they are still in touch with you. Like, because they're grappling with the same questions, they have the same struggles as we do, even if they're different. They're very similar. Just like, how do we live? How do we show love? How like can we be good neighbors? Like, just, I don't know.
And today materialism is a huge thing. Yeah. I bet tons of people relate to getting lost in the things I want and what I look like to other people. I don't have the name brand this, I don't have the name brand that. Yeah. So I'm lesser than. He brings that up. It's like, no, it's not about the money. Yes,
it's not. And what's interesting about that is like, even with Scrooge's money, he kind of lives like a hermit.
He does.
Like, he like uses the least amount of fire. He uses it like, and we'll get into this in like the more like big spoiler kind of stories that like I feel like they don't touch in the adaptations as much. But he lives so frugally despite having, like Hallie's point, billions. Yeah. For the time. And so it just shows that what does it mean to live a rich life, really? I think is what it comes down to. Yeah. But anyways, we're excited to get into the spoilers. Thank you guys for joining a briefer episode.
I hope that was informative and interesting. So as you guys go into the book, you have a little bit of background to get you started into it.
Yeah. I think I said briefer. I don't even know if that's a word. More brief. Know
what? We'll just go with it.
Yeah. But thank you guys so much. Yeah, we did. There we go. Shakespeare. Making up words. Literally. But anyways, thank you guys so much.
Bye.